humans have been contemplating the nature of their existence, the miracle of life, and the finality of death for thousands of years. One such mortal man, the protagonist in our story, a Mr. Thomas Martin, undertaker by profession and genealogist by obsession, believed that confirmation of death was, in fact, the best evidence that life once stood in its place. He acquired this understanding through years of documentation, records, death records, names, dates, endings. That was until the day the endings he thought were final started communicating with him. What had once been a quiet and routine life for Martin, defined by ink, genealogy charts, and death records, had now become something altogether different for him, something fluid, something responsive, something that did not wait patiently in silence after being recorded, but instead reached outward and made itself known. And so, on the morning after the discovery of his childhood possessions within his grandmother's coffin, a coffin that never before existed but mysteriously was uncovered in the cemetery he created in his backyard, Thomas Martin did what he had always done when confronted with uncertainty. He attempted to confirm it. He researched it, not with emotion, not with fear, but with intention and precision. That morning, the kitchen table looked as it did every other morning. His buttered toast, his hot coffee. However, that morning, these items were no longer part of his routine. They were incidental. Now Martin's attention rested entirely on the task before him. He spent the entire day searching the internet for individuals who possessed expert information about the afterlife. He searched carefully and systematically for hours on end without a break, not looking for superstition, not for the occult, not for folklore, but for practitioners, individuals who claimed with confidence and certitude they had the ability to communicate with the dead. The search term for such individuals is spiritual medium. Martin visited dozens of websites, each one offering a variation of the same promise: closure, connection, comfort. Testimonials that read like rehearsed grief, AI-generated graphics that suggested credibility without proving it. Most entries he dismissed immediately, but one website held his attention. It was Emily Westbrook's, a medium who resided in the next town over from Ashwick. Her website was simple, unadorned, direct, and one detail in particular stood out for Martin. She claimed to have a 100% success rate in communicating with the deceased. Thomas Martin did not believe in coincidence, nor did he believe in perfection, but he believed in anomalies, and anomalies such as a 100% success rate warranted investigation. He called Emily that night. Their conversation was brief, measured. Martin revealed little. Emily asked little. There was an understanding, unspoken but mutual, that the details would come later. They made an appointment to meet each other at her home the following day at 11 a.m. And, as always, Thomas Martin arrived early and thoroughly prepared. Emily's home did not resemble what he had preconceived. There were no symbols, no theatrical trappings of mysticism. It was an ordinary split-level ranch, modest and clean, with an air of quiet and orderly professionalism. She greeted him at the door. She was entirely unremarkable in appearance, which to Martin made her all the more interesting. She was about Martin's height, hair color honey blonde, and she wore glasses. She appeared to be composed, friendly, and observant. They went inside and sat at the opposite ends of the sofa in her living room. Emily asked Martin to state the nature of his business. Martin began. He spoke as he always did, clearly, precisely, without embellishment. He explained his profession, his devotion to genealogy, his creation of the symbolic family cemetery in his backyard, 37 headstones, each bearing the name and date of death of one of his deceased family members. He then described the blank headstone he placed there for himself and the day it had changed, how the stone, once empty, had mysteriously become engraved with his name and the date of his death, a date that had already passed, the precise date on which he established the cemetery 1 year ago. He took out his cell phone and showed Emily before and after photographs of his headstone. Emily examined the photos carefully. She said nothing, so he continued. The excavation beneath his headstone, his coffin, the inscription with his name and date of death, the emptiness inside it, the subsequent excavations of the remaining graves, the discovery of 37 identical coffins beneath each headstone. In describing what happened in detail, Martin deliberately did not mention the contents of his parents' and siblings' coffins. No recounting of knives from his set of silverware or the letters of invitation he found in their coffins. Not the implications. Some truths, even for a man like Thomas Martin, remained strategically withheld. He handed her his cell phone and showed her the text message he received from his deceased grandfather, the black and white photograph attached. He explained the absence of that same photograph from the family albums he stored in his attic, his grandfather's signature on the text, the instruction he received from his grandfather to open his grandmother's coffin next, and lastly, the discovery of his teddy bear baby and his blanket in his grandmother's coffin. Preserved, perfect, impossible. After Martin finished his summary of events, the room became uncomfortably quiet. Emily sat back slightly, studied him, not with skepticism, not with judgment, but with something far more valuable, honesty. "I never have seen anything like this," she said. Her voice was calm. Her delivery was unforced. "In over 20 years of my working as a medium, I've never heard a story like yours." Thomas Martin nodded as this was the response he expected. "I need an explanation," he said. "Can you explain what is happening?" Emily exhaled softly. Then after a pause she smiled, not warmly, not reassuringly. Speaking plainly and directly, Emily said, "You are not going to like this." Martin replied, "I don't like or dislike explanations. I assess them." Emily nodded. "Fair enough." Then another pause. "The work I do as a medium," she said, "is purely performance." Thomas Martin did not react. "I conduct seances," she said. "I speak to people in advance. They provide me with information about their loved ones, and I create a plausible story. Sometimes purposely vague, and other times specific, enough to create the illusion of a connection between the living and the dead, an illusion, enough to suspend reality and conjure a belief about the presence of a person's loved one being in the room with them, if only for a moment." Then Emily leaned forward slightly toward Martin and said, "Here's the truth. I have never communicated with the deceased." This statement hung in the air for a moment, straightforward, uncomplicated, undeniable. She continued, "To the best of my knowledge, no human has ever communicated with the dead. It's just not possible." And now, it's time for us to take a brief respite and listen to an intermezzo conceived by world-renowned composer E. Dudeks, after which the saga of Thomas Martin will resume. We continue. Thomas Martin reflected on what Emily had just said. He processed it. Her admission that mediums cannot communicate with the deceased did not invalidate what Martin had experienced over the past year. If anything, it helped to sharpen it. "Then what I am experiencing is completely unique," he said. "It's more than unique. It is incomprehensible. It is surreal," Emily replied. Silence followed. Then something changed. Emily's expression shifted, not into belief, but into curiosity. "You said something earlier about the cemetery," she said. Thomas Martin nodded. "The headstone," she continued. "There were no bodies, no coffins, just markers?" "Yes," said Martin. "And then when you dug up your backyard, the coffins were there, correct?" "Yes," said Martin. "You did not place them there yourself. You just found them in the ground when you excavated, correct?" "Yes," said Martin. Emily leaned back, folded her hands, and for the first time since the conversation began, she looked intrigued. "Do you believe," she asked slowly, "that what's happening is tied to you, only you?" Thomas Martin considered. "I believe it is tied to the system I created." Emily nodded. Then she said, "I have an idea." Her words were simple, but their implication was profound. She stood, walked slowly to the window, looked out, and said, "What's happening in your cemetery is real." Thomas Martin remained silent. "It's not performance, not coincidence, not some psychological trick or hallucination." She turned back to him and said, "Then the question becomes, why you?" Martin did not answer because the question had already begun to form in his own mind. Emily continued, "Or is it just you?" A pause, then, "What if it's not?" She stepped closer. "What if it's not you, but the place itself?" Thomas Martin's gaze sharpened. "Say more." Emily smiled slightly. "People come to me every day," she said. "They want to speak to the dead. They want confirmation, closure, proof." She gestured toward him. "You may have found something that actually does that." Thomas Martin said nothing, but his attention was absolute. "What if," Emily continued, "you extended your cemetery?" Another pause. "Added headstones that aren't members of your family?" The room grew very still. "Clients of mine," she said. "People desperate to connect. Let me give you 5 names." She moved towards her desk, retrieved a small notepad, wrote carefully, then handed it to him. 5 names, 5 dates of death, unrelated to him, unconnected, strangers. "If your cemetery produces the same results for them," she said quietly, "then we will know." Thomas Martin looked at the list, then back at her. "Are you proposing an experiment?" "Yes," she said. "For financial gain?" "Yes, and for proof." Because it made sense, Thomas Martin nodded. Because it was methodical. Because it introduced variables. Thomas Martin thrived on variables. "I will need to verify these records," he said. "Of course," she answered. "And order the stones." "Of course," she said, "and place them accordingly." Emily smiled and said, "Of course." A silence passed between them, not uncomfortable, but significant, because something had shifted. This was no longer a consultation. It was a collaboration. Thomas Martin stood from the sofa. "I will proceed," he said. Emily nodded. "And Mr. Martin?" He paused. "Yes? If this works." She hesitated. "Then it changes everything." Thomas Martin considered that, then replied, "Everything has already changed." And he left. The drive home was quiet, measured, purposeful, because for the first time since this began, he was not simply uncovering something. He was testing it, expanding it, applying it. The cemetery awaited. The ground, the stones, the system, and soon 5 new entries, 5 new names, 5 new possibilities. Would the earth respond? Would the coffins appear? Would dead unrelated to him, unconnected to him, begin to communicate? And if they did, what would that mean for Emily, for her clients, for the nature of her performance, and most importantly, for Thomas Martin? Because if the phenomenon existed beyond his family, then it was no longer personal. It was universal. And if it was universal, then the system he had discovered was not a curiosity. It was a mechanism, a process, a function, one that operated beyond belief, beyond intention, beyond control. And as Thomas Martin pulled into his driveway, the cemetery standing silently behind his home, he understood something with perfect clarity. He was no longer documenting death. He was facilitating rebirth, resurrection. And somewhere beneath the soil that had already begun to answer him, something was waiting, not just for him, but for others. The 5 names, the 5 new stones, the 5 new entries. Because in a place where the dead could communicate beyond the grave, where memory could manifest, and where the ground itself seemed to respond to the presence of names and dates, the question was no longer whether the system worked. The question was who or what was controlling it, and what would happen when it was expanded. In a quiet, small New England town, where an undertaker has begun to cultivate something far more than a cemetery, where science, superstition, and something altogether unknown converge, we wait for the next entry, for the next revelation, for the next message from beyond the final record, because Thomas Martin has opened a door, and now others are about to walk through it, a place where performance may become reality, where the dead may finally answer, and where the boundaries of life and death are no longer fixed but negotiable, a place known as the Conflation Station.